Hi, hello, and welcome to my review of Fire Emblem Engage. I'm gonna start us off with a disclaimer. I'm old, grumpy, and also opinionated. I play Fire Emblem for the story and the characters, so the gameplay matters to me, but a lot less than those other two things. Also, please keep in mind that while I will give examples of things I didn't like about, say, the story, I won't point out every single thing I didn't care for. Spoilers for Engage will be found in this review, and you'll probably also hear spoilers for previous games as well. If that might bother you, please do turn back now. For everyone else, let's begin. I'm actually going to start this review off with the TLDR. The gameplay is pretty good, the story is really bad, and the characters are a mixed bag because they oftentimes feel completely separate from the world they live in. But a few are rather charming and might worm their way into your heart despite the game actively and constantly trying to prevent you from caring about them. So let's start with the gameplay. I won't touch on too much here since I'm not an expert, but I do want to talk about the gameplay because I think it's quite good. So let's start with the break and the weapon triangle. The weapon triangle never should have left in the first place, but I think the addition of break makes things mechanically kind of fun and incentivizes thinking through both the player and enemy phase a bit more. So in the past, it wasn't uncommon for you to get like an overpowered or like defensive unit, put them on a tile, and like let the enemy just go at them for a while. The break mechanic doesn't really disincentivize doing that, but it does de-incentivize it. Like, you have to think a little bit more carefully about where you're putting people because the break mechanic can make the next hit kill if you're not careful, and I do like that. Unit types are also in the game now. I don't remember if they were in Three Houses or not because I wasn't paying attention, but we have like armored units who I believe are immune to break, cavalry units, which of course have like the movement stuff, mystical units, which are tome wielders who ignore terrain bonuses, and backup units who will always chain attack. These are kind of neat and give you a few more things to pay attention to on the battlefield when it comes to enemy phase, but then also you can use these to your advantage on player phase, so pretty fun, I think. We also have Adepts and Chain Guard, which make things kind of interesting, especially chain guarding on the enemy side, because it forces you to pay attention to what you're attacking instead of just mindlessly attacking things. Not that anyone attacking on the harder difficulties wouldn't be looking, but even on casual play, you do kind of have to pay a little bit more attention. You can also, like everything else, use this to your advantage when it comes to player phase. Chain attacks are also in the game. I think it's a nice addition to have some, like, backup units or units that have trained in it be able to chain attack. The 80% chance to hit with chain attacks helps balance it a little bit, but it does also force you to pay attention because enemies can also chain attack. I think you're sensing a running theme. So let's talk about weapons. We have unlimited use weapons in Engage. I know this is a highly debated topic in the fandom. As a casual, I don't really have an opinion on it. Sometimes I like it. The one thing that I do want to comment on regarding unlimited weapon uses is that in previous games you would often have a Jagan unit who had an overpowered weapon. So think Seth from FE8. So Seth, you would just send him out with the Silver Lance, and the advantage of having the Silver Lance was that you could one round basically anything with it. And additionally, you had to pay attention with how many times you use that because you only had your, I think it was 20 uses. So you don't want to waste it, you know what I mean? When it comes to unlimited weapon or weapon uses, rather, you don't get the Silver Lance, or in Vander's case, you don't get a Silver Axe because that's ridiculously overpowered with unlimited weapon uses. Instead, he gets the same garbage weapons that everybody else gets, so he doesn't really feel like a Jagan in that sense. Vander's role in Engage feels more like he's meant to whittle the enemy down and that then the other units are able to pick them off. And I think the unlimited weapon uses and giving him just the Iron Axe makes that happen a little bit more easily, but I don't know. It just mess with that, like, what your expectations of a Jagan unit are. And I don't hate it, I don't love it. I will say for the unlimited use weapons though, like the game needs to throw less weapons at you in general in that sense because holy shit, your convoy just gets filled up with so much crap. I feel like forging, engraving, all of the varied weapon types, like we have the radiant bow and stuff like that, that's really cool, gives you some more tools to play around with. It's kind of fun, I guess. Staves, however, have limited uses, so your healing magic, your warp, rewarp, all of that stuff. I don't know how I feel about that because, like, when all the weapons are unlimited, like, why does it matter if the healing is? But, I mean, it makes a little bit more sense with things like warp and rewarp, but eventually you can kind of, like, almost nearly just freely buy those. So does it really matter? I guess I'm gonna just go with its inventory management and let that go, because it's not a hill I'm willing to die on. Moving on to map design, overall I think it's pretty good. There are a lot of tools for dealing with the things that the game throws at you, and knowledge of the maps helps you progress faster or even more effectively on later playthroughs, which is a staple of Fire Emblem in my opinion. I don't play for the maps, so I don't really have too much of an opinion on this, but no map felt like too much of a slog to me in terms of like engagement, pun intended, question mark. Like as a comparison, Hector Hard Mode, Cog of Destiny, also known as Slog of Destiny, that map fucking sucks. And I always doubted that it sucked that much until I played it myself, and then I was like, wait, actually, this does suck. This is not fun. This feels extremely tedious. You're almost like waiting out reinforcements. It's that annoying. Engage didn't have anything that felt like that. And I think especially when you consider that after your first playthrough, you kind of know a little bit more what to expect from the map, and therefore know how to counter it better. So there is that. Moving on to the emblems. So I'm not really sure how I feel about the emblems for gameplay purposes. Like, Lyn can be used to cheese a lot of maps, like the Lumera map, for example, where I just blasted her down from 20 tiles away and used the recharge things to cheese that. Yep. But at the same time, like, non-emblems can also be used to cheese maps, like your warp and rewarp strategies. So I think as a mechanic, they were interesting, but I'm starting to tire of Fire Emblem more or less having gimmicks in each game that don't carry to the next. It reminds me of some of the mistakes World of Warcraft and Pokemon have made where there's just always some big gimmick to play around. In WoW, this was legendary weapons in Legion, Azerite armor in Battle for Azeroth, and Covenants in Shadowlands. And in Pokemon, there was Mega Evolution, and then Dynamaxing, and Terastallizing. And yeah, in WoW, these gimmicks were more like issues of power creep time sinks, and in Pokemon, they tried to like use these new changes to mix up or change the meta, but I had a hard time enjoying them because I knew they were just going to disappear in the next expansion or in the next game, and oftentimes this ruins the coherence of like the world building and story writing anyway, on top of that. So it's a little bit less fun for me in general. I'm not really a gimmick enjoyer, shall we say. The emblems themselves feel like lip service battalions from Three Houses, and while I like using Lyn to cheese maps as much as the next guy, there's honestly just such a huge disconnect between Emblem Lyn and actual Lyn. Making Lyn a bow unit makes sense in terms of variety, and the fact that her promoted class, she does let her use a bow, but wielding a sword was basically her entire character in Fire Emblem 7. Emblem Lyn feels like she was just ported over from Fire Emblem Heroes. And that feels like straight shit to me as an OG Lyn enjoyer who does not play or care about Heroes. And I think the worst part about the emblems is really that they are just battalions with fresh paint, except the paint is boring and poorly explained in the story and also awkward and weird. I'll get to that more in the story sections, but like, I just wasn't very impressed with the emblems as emblems. They were okay as gimmicks, though. For our last gameplay section thing, I want to just like really quickly talk about paralogs. Whew. Okay, so I respect that they tried to give you a reason to do these, like setting your emblem bond caps to 20, but the bond caps in general felt like artificial stopgaps that existed for no reason but to waste my time in the first place. So I didn't really like that they tied the emblems into them like that. The maps as nods to old games were fine, but even as a Fire Emblem old, I wasn't particularly delighted by them. But I'll talk more about that after story and characters. And to be fair, I know why they put the stopgap of the bond caps in, and that was to get the little conversations with the emblems. And like those literally just did nothing for me, so like story-wise or gameplay-wise. So I just didn't enjoy it at all. Now let's talk about the Somniel. So story-wise, the Somniel is stupid, on more or less infinite levels due to, you know, being a safe haven, but Lumera for some reason never stored the rings there. Absolutely unforgivable writing job right there. Three Houses did a better job at ensuring that the home base felt narratively reasonable most of the time. However, if you don't look at the Somniel under a story lens, I think it functions pretty well. When you visit it, you do start out right by all the vendors and near the cafe. It's not hard to navigate around, it's not too big. Dropping items into the well is silly, and so are the bond rings. I was hoping all the characters would be available as rings from the old games, even if they just had stats on them, because, I don't know, I thought it would be kind of cute to see, like, who got what stat, but nope, just a few characters made it in. And out of those, even fewer had cool abilities on them. This was just like a gacha style gambling thing that did almost nothing because 99% of these rings are irrelevant and a waste of time. Speaking of rings, the ring room was ridiculous and I hated it. I also hate having to go there to inherit skills and roll rings, but then navigate to another window to equip skills. That should just be a thing in the regular menu, to be honest. Speaking of things that are silly, fishing, strength training, all the minigames actually just in general. If there are going to be minigames, I would rather there just be one single good one, rather than a bunch of tedious, boring ones. Like a card game I can play against the other characters, or a puzzle game a la World of Warcraft's Puzzle World Quests. Something short, easy, maybe even fun. Which I know is asking a lot after seeing how tedious that fishing game is. I appreciate the activities, like the orchard and stuff, that the characters can do together. This seems like an easier, less annoying, and stupid version of what Three Houses did to build supports, and a couple of these do tend to net you like an extra support now and again, which is kind of nice. That said, the pool is an interesting and weird choice for an addition. This feels so ridiculously modern, along with the bathing suits, but then, like, so do basically all the other outfits. And part of me is like, oh, I don't hate the other outfits, like, as just, like, a fun thing, because, like, it is a little bit funny to see Vander walking around in sunglasses, but, like, really? I don't know. It's not for me, though. It's not for me, I guess. The biggest crime of the Somniel, though, is that it feels really empty and weird. It doesn't feel lively despite characters telling us that it is. I don't know how I would fix that exactly, but characters just standing around or sitting together but not even talking is boring. The things characters say are also rather boring and repetitive, basically to the point of it feeling like a waste of time to even talk to anyone. I feel like it's disingenuous of me to point out issues while failing to provide solutions, so, to fix this, I guess I would probably have just tried to ensure, like, more specific conversations or dialogue and interactions could be seen in the Somniel. For example, certain characters having a conversation that you can overhear, or several characters playing games together and having dialogue for that could be fun. Like, two characters playing chess in the cafe or playing hopscotch in the training area. And maybe that's overkill, so, like, just take it with a grain of salt, I guess. It's, like, just a random idea. But the Somniel was about as interesting as an Animal Crossing island, with none of the charm or decorating potential and, like, frankly, less dialogue options. Emblems hanging around there also should have been more interesting, but they're just kind of there. Boring. Moving on to the user interface. It's bad. Inheriting and equipping skills should be simply, like, together in the menu. Hell, anything ring-related should be under emblem rings if we're doing, like, nested options. I quite hate the UI of this game, and the controls aren't very satisfying or responsive either. This is hard to explain, but the number of times I, like, overshot my mark on the map, or I accidentally rewound the crystal because the game didn't respond to, like, the menu and then me pressing up to hit end turn. Like, I was too fast for the game, and I just, like, I'm not used to that happening, and I didn't really care for it, especially in a modern game. You'd think, if anything, the controls would be more responsive, not less than older games. It's also weird that references doesn't have, like, the support log there. Just in general, a lot of the menus aren't very intuitive. Inventory is a slog, so, like, why don't items stack when they're not equipped or held? And why can't I buy 10 vulneraries at once? In short, the UI is just pretty bad, and there's a lot of room for improvement there. So moving on to sound, voice acting is overall like super on point, really, really good. I did play in English and 100% confirmed. Most of those voices were incredible, honestly. The voice actors really gave it their all, and you can tell. I wasn't a fan of all of the voices, but I can admit that saying I don't like Lynn's voice is more or less just me being an OG Lynn Enjoyer snob. That and the way the Emblem voices kind of like echo just made me a little itchy anyway. The music is quite good too. I enjoyed a lot of it. And more importantly, the default balance of music and sound works pretty well. I never felt that the music was drowning out spoken dialogue, for example. I do feel like there should have been a default setting for voice acting to say Alir's name, at least. The constant Divine One, Divine Dragon shit was annoying and took away from emotional moments to unfathomable degrees. And now we get to the fun part. Let's talk about character design. I want to talk about eyes first. The way Three Houses' art style chose to depict character eyes was disconcerting, to put it mildly. I did get used to it after a while and it didn't bother me so much, but I feel like Engage had good intentions with character design in this regard specifically. Most of the characters looked a lot more alive in Engage, but then they overshot things to an extreme with a handful of the cast, which is unfortunate in my opinion. In general, I don't like the character designs because I feel they exist separately from the world the characters supposedly inhabit. Every character looks like a special snowflake VTuber slash gotcha game character instead of just some guy who happens to join your army, which, to be fair, a lot of these characters aren't just regular guys, but that's a criticism for the story, I guess. I still feel like it's important for designs to make sense, though, and find the everyone looks completely unique shtick to be tiresome and honestly kinda cringe. The amount of times I've scrolled Reddit's main page and saw stuff from the Genshin Impact fandom that I mistook for Engage at first is not only non-zero, but this has happened several times. I think that's a problem. To clarify this a little bit better, as general designs of characters, a lot of the designs are fun. Panette, for example, looks really cool. Even though she's not an aesthetic I subscribe to, I can see the appeal. But like, and I mean this nicely, she doesn't belong in Fire Emblem. Now, if Engage was a parody of Fire Emblem games, really like over the top and silly, didn't ever take itself seriously, etc., I feel like we would still want a few characters with ridiculous designs because there's always at least one, and that would have been the parody. But looking back at a lot of old character designs over the years, there aren't that many characters who, say, have multicolored hair, or ridiculously long hair, or even over the top outfits. Xavia's design as like a parody of Camilla's would be fine, for example, and even funny, but there are way too many boobs in this game, and I never thought I would say that. Like, the Tumblr fans calling Camilla Titty Strap 666 for the longest time was honestly pretty funny, but it was only funny because we didn't have her name at first, and also she was like more or less the only character that was like that. This is an issue because regardless of the truth, it feels like the character designs were made completely separate from the game itself. It's as if they were created in a vacuum where knowledge about who the characters were meant to be, and even what characters in Fire Emblem are usually like, didn't exist. Like, I don't know, you tell me why Ivy from the coldest nation is wearing such a revealing outfit, or why she has these impractical spikes that are more likely to get her killed than give her any combat advantage. Like several other outfits, her design just seems to kind of exist as a completely separate thing from the character and from what that character would reasonably wear according to the country she's from and her personality. Again, if she was an outlier, this would be fine or excusable, but she's not. That's not to say all the designs are bad. Despite how I feel about Engage's story, for the sake of that story, I can accept Alir's design in general. Also, being a special snowflake god gives Alir some right to look different, I guess. I do wish the meta red-blue thing wasn't so on the nose and poorly implemented, but I'm 99% certain the designer was told to design the character this way, and so I cannot fault them for that. Vander, for example, other than looking like a baby with fake facial hair and as if he is wearing some World of Warcraft male armor, has a nice design, I guess, and I could nitpick Clan and Fram's designs, but like overall they do look okay. And so does Diamant, Alcryst, Jade, Citrine, Lapis, Saphir, Zelkov, Goldmary, Anna, Linden. Okay, you get the picture. About half the designs are honestly okay or even good. They could use like a little bit of work maybe, but they don't anger me. They don't feel over the top, they don't feel like too ridiculous. There are also a lot of designs that I would like a lot more if they were tweaked. Rosado is really cool, to be honest, but his wyvern doesn't stand out as much with all the other decorated wyverns around. Which you could say is an illusion thing, but one, I don't care, and two, it's a crime against Rosado specifically, since it feels like putting bows on his wyvern is a particularly in-character thing for him to do. I wouldn't necessarily change his design, but the wyverns and mounts of other characters I would. Marin and the Wolf Knights in general, having that tail is just confusing. Also, her outfit mimics an ascot and what might be a weird corset looking thing, but like neither of these things are actually functioning as those things. They just look like that for fun, which I feel like every outfit should get a pass on that to a small degree, but the lack of cohesion just drags her design down. Tamara's design without the balls would be cute and like really sporty looking, but the balls just make her look ridiculous, and I hate that for her. If everyone from Psalm had these like bracelets in these colors or like hair accessories, and she just went like, I'm the crown princess, so I'm gonna do that, but everywhere, go big or go home, and that served like some kind of narrative or like character function, I would give them a pass, but they just look so silly and they give me nothing. Girl, you're in the desert. What are these for? I feel like if she jumped in the water, that she would float because of them. Alfred's design is so close to being good, but they overshot him in basically the same way that they did Marin and Tamara. Maybe even worse. When you stop to like look at him, the more you look at him, the dumber he looks. This goes back to what I said about Marin and the ascot tie. Like, it really should just be an actual ascot tie and not some cloth stapled onto the front of their clothes. But we also have excessive ruffles for no reason and a weird crisscrossing lace thing that just looks bad. Like, get this shit out of here. Anyway, even though there are a good number of well-designed or okay-designed characters, I still think there was a lot of room for improvement with regards to tying the designs in with the world and the character personalities, not to mention culture. Like, they really missed a peak opportunity for Saline to come out dressed like her brother when she asks her mom to join Alir. She could still show up in the Somniel dressed up in her poofy, like, princess gowns or whatever. Granted, that's me projecting my opinion on Saline and also the game in general, but I think it would have made, like, a more intriguing character thing and, like, lent credence to her supposed ruthless dedication to Firene and doing what must be done, even if it's not something she particularly wants to do or likes. But nope, girl really shows up on the battlefield in that huge dress, and thanks, I hate it. Like, that's a liability. Do you understand how that's a liability? That makes you a liability. I'm sorry, I can't stand it. Like, I can't. I can't suspend my disbelief that much. If her initial chapter had her wearing it, and then she switched to a different outfit, I feel like that would be fine, because it would be like, oh, I wore it that one time because I had to. But we don't get that because, God forbid, we get things that make sense. So, it is me just nitpicking. Like, it's not the worst thing about this game, and I think it goes back to, like, if it was the only bad thing about the game, if, like, the character designs were the only thing that drove me nuts, this would be a great fucking game. But it's not. So, unfortunately, overall, I have to say the designs were, like, kind of a miss. If for no other reason, then they feel completely disconnected from the characters themselves, the worlds they inhabit, and they don't even bother to reflect any kind of cohesive culture, which should be especially standout between Elusia and the other nations, but isn't. For example, when playing FE6 and FE7, all of the characters from Sakai or with Sakaean heritage are like recognizable as hailing from Sakai, not just the way that their face looks or their hair color, but also like their outfits. That does a lot for cohesion and world building, even if it doesn't seem like it does. Moving on to the visuals and graphics, so there are some kind of like cut corners, I guess, with the visuals in this game. Like, the way a lot of the cutscenes use the 3D models and so on, but overall, I feel like in general, they really went out of their way to try to make nice looking environments and models. I prefer Three Houses' more sensible look and find that more visually appealing personally, but in terms of model quality, Engage is definitely a step up. That said, I'm not sure how I feel about being able to run around after battles. So much work was put into the 3D rendering of battlefields, and this worked really well to make battle transitions feel seamless. Like, I didn't turn off battle animations for my whole first playthrough, when usually it's something I turn off right before I get to the halfway point in a new game, and completely for all subsequent playthroughs. However, that was undoubtedly a lot of work, and I do wonder if it was worth it? So if the point was strictly to ensure that the battle animations felt good and smooth, like the transition into battle I mean, then I applaud the effort. However, if they rendered the battlegrounds in 3D specifically so that the environment could be moved through in the after battle scenes, then eh? It's possible the latter was just a product of the former, like they made it 3D to make the transition into combat look nicer and feel smoother, and then added the after battle stuff to kind of like double dip into that asset that they had already created. In which case, I think they just didn't do enough to make the after battle stuff feel meaningful. It just feels like really empty, which is more or less my biggest issue with Engage anyway, on like just a general level. But they do get points for trying, since it is like a new feature that they've added, and I like the concept, I think. I will say that despite not loving the character designs, the models themselves do look quite nice. I just wish the game hadn't relied on them so heavily for everything. I don't know that I would call it lazy, but doing this puts a nail in the coffin of suspension of disbelief in a way that still character portraits never did. To go into a bit more detail here, I think video game storytelling is quite similar to screenplay writing, specifically for plays, not films. A lot hinges on the specific shortcuts taken to explain and show information, and there's a certain expectation of your audience to suspend their disbelief to see, say, the painted backdrop trees as a shortcut to their understanding that the characters are in a forest. I think Fire Emblem has always worked best when it leaned into this type of storytelling, especially because the games have always been split pretty 50-50 on being about storytelling and gameplay. For like a quick example of another scene that would not be helped by 3D models, let's look at Fire Emblem 7. So early in FE7, Lyn runs into Kent and Sane in Bulgar. Their horses are blocking the road while they talk like they're a couple of grannies blocking the aisle at the Piggly Wiggly with their grocery carts. She asks them to please move, and Kent agrees immediately because he's not rude. They then supposedly start to move, and Kent pauses in doing this because he feels like he knows Lyn from somewhere, thus kicking off the bulk of the game. We don't need the game to show us this in 3D or with 3D models, and I would argue that doing so would make it harder to suspend our disbelief. Bulgar is the biggest trading town and settlement in Sakai, and a 3D models using cutscene a la Engage would just look empty minus the 4 characters involved. I doubt they'd even remember to include the horses. When it's all laid out in front of you, but in like a super subpar or even bad way, it does not aid in visual understanding. It actually just impedes it. There are countless other examples where 3D models might actually like make a scene worse if it's not done like superbly, right? So imagine in FE7 Eliwood's father dying, but like that's done in the same 3D model way that Engage's scenes were done in. Like, good voice acting can carry to some degree, but if the scene felt empty, like nobody else was standing around, or even trying to help, or standing there awkwardly, like looking at each other, like the way that Engage does its death scenes, like this would be awful. I feel like it would just ruin all of the emotional impact, right? There's also a scene in FE8 where Erica runs to rescue Innes, Garrick, and Tethys, or even if you want to be like really bitchy about that scene, just Garrick and Tethys arguing with Innes about like whether or not they should abandon him is like, it would just look so dumb in 3D without like a lot of work done to make it look good. If you don't put maximum effort into a scene like that, it's not any better than the still portraits. In fact, I would argue that it's worse. Here's a really big one from FE8, the scene with Orson and Monica. I think you get the picture here. 3D model scenes look stupid and empty, especially as they're done in Engage, and they would just become more detrimental to the storytelling, specifically of these older games, rather than helpful. And I feel like in Engage, they are sometimes very detrimental or super detrimental in the case of like many examples that we'll get to that are already kind of bad for storytelling reasons but are made worse by the 3D models and just the lack of attention to how they were being used and shown. The TLDR here is that the models look good, but I wish that they just had not overused them. Seeing the same model animations play through basically every scene, like that shy ooh-woo twist and shout pose that Alir does, just makes it clear that they only had a few options to pick from in terms of animations, and it didn't really feel like it was enough. I feel like in modern gaming, you really need to figure out what you're going for and then put all of your effort into achieving it. If we're going to do 3D models for literally everything, they need to be up to the challenge of working for the entire duration of the game. Three Houses model animation was stiff and needed work too, but the game knew to use and rely on still portraits a lot because of that, which I think was smart. And now we get to the real meat and potatoes of this review, the story. So the characters and the story feel like they are just an excuse for the gameplay to exist. Like they were slapped together in a hurry at the last second, 11:59 p.m. college paper submission material. They don't feel like something that was thought through carefully, lovingly, or even passionately. I don't want to spend 1,000 years on this topic because I feel like it's a dead horse, pardon the phrase, and it's been beat to death many times over, and by people more eloquent than I am. However, the story straight up sucks, and I don't want to pretend that it doesn't. So I'll spend 750 years on it instead. I've seen the argument that Engage is a light-hearted Fire Emblem game, that it's a parody game, that it's not meant to be taken seriously and is supposed to be, quote, fun, unquote. Okay, cool. So why didn't it feel cohesively silly then? Why is there so much emotional manipulation? Why does the narrative and even character writing contradict itself and even gaslight the player multiple times? Why does the game try to tell me how to feel over and over again? Like, no matter how you slice it, even if you believe the game is a parody, even if you want to imagine it's just supposed to be really fun and goofy, the writing is bad. It doesn't achieve its goals. A good writer and a good writing team can produce a good parody or good humor story and characters. This game didn't do that. Period. I don't think I'm going to change anyone's mind on this, and frankly, if you had a lot of fun with Engage's story, I think that's great. The story made me want to tear my hair out, though. The worst part about some of the storytelling in Engage is honestly just how no real effort went into a lot of the scenes. For example, at Destinia Cathedral, the hounds block the main entrance and your other enemies are up by the altar and the front of the church. You're literally sandwiched in there, but you escape in a way that is not explained. This could have easily been fixed by having the hounds come in from the sides at the front of the church by the altar, like from the back rooms, leaving the main entrance and potential for escape open. It's such a small thing, but that's the problem with Engage, isn't it? It's a million small things, and when they start snowballing, the snowball doesn't stay small. The way the visuals contradict the story here is maddening, like the difficulty, but we see it a lot over the course of the game, including every single time we're talking to a villain's face, and then they teleport away. Or we're teleported away, with no explanation. Another example of a small fix visual, somehow Hyacinth drops Emblem Lyn on the floor when Sombron eats him. Convenient. This could have been a character bit, if only we saw him trying to twist the ring off before he was swallowed. The fact that it was retrievable at all, by anyone but Sombron shitting it out, should have pointed to something with regards to Hyacinth as a character, as a person, but nope, we don't get that. The story did do something interesting with the flight from Destinia Cathedral, at least. It felt dangerous and like a low point for the characters, both in the gameplay and in the story, which is rare and quite a feat, I think. This is one of the only praiseworthy things about this game's story, though, which is really disappointing. And it feels undermined by the Fade to Black getaway and the fact that our escape doesn't quite feel earned or make sense when, gameplay-wise, the hounds and countless ring-bearing corrupted were literally right on our heels. Another good thing the story did was kill Marnie and not Mavir. Usually in games like this, we would see the loyal knight die, especially because he's so obviously and immediately the token good guy of the villain group. But letting Marnie have a change of heart toward Vale instead and die to try to save her was a good moment. Or it would have been if Marnie wasn't such a hateable character, even being nasty toward Vale for like the whole game. That she only feels any empathy or care for Vale at all is because she has a sad backstory, which. The fuck? Yuck. Dude, I don't care about her. And also her design is stupid, but like, I could have cared. I could have cared. If only the writers cared enough to let me, instead of twisting my arm over and over throughout the story to try to make every death a big emotional moment without actually putting in the work to just let it naturally feel that way. Like, they want me to care, but they didn't earn my care. This is one of like a billion examples of the writers having a nugget of a good idea, but then undermining it into literal oblivion. Also, the scene itself looks silly with everyone just standing by and letting Zephyr RP walk up to Marnie to stab her. In light of all that, I'd almost have rather seen Mavir try to flee earlier in the story with Vale, like Seth did with Erica in FE8. I'll bring this up again in a later point, not too far down from here, but I mean, that would have at least read like a nod to FE8, especially if he sustained some kind of injury in doing this. And I do feel like if the point of Engage was to celebrate previous games, like, doing things like this could have been really fun and, forgive me for the joke, but engaging? I digress. Speaking of the hounds, though, they were fucking terrible. Gris was creepy, but not in a fun way. I think he could have been somewhat interesting, but like, I don't know, man. I do have to give his voice actor credit because he really sold the Gris is into pain and suffering thing, but no part of me enjoyed hearing him sound halfway to orgasm every time he talked about it. Yikes. Like, we can't show Zephyr hitting Vale, but we can definitely have this voice acting. Like, dude, there are so many things about this supposedly family-friendly game that would have gotten it taken away from me if I had been a teenager. Like, my parents would have seen this and been like, no, you're not playing that. That I just have a really hard time, like, coming to terms with the fact that, like, is this actually a family-friendly game? Because I don't think it is. I don't think you know what that means. Anyway, I did pick up on his, like, big connection in the group being to Zephyr, so I guess that's something. I really thought their connection was going to be a romantic one, but letting it be more of a family connection was a nice surprise. Too bad the reveal was dog shit. Zephyr sucked. This is gonna be way too long of a thing, but I can't delete it. Like, I have to rant, okay? So hearing that her motivation for following Sombron was to have a baby was maybe one of the dumbest fucking things I've ever heard in a Fire Emblem game. She doesn't even love him and knows he kills his children regularly, so what is the point of this? I feel like world building could have made it a little less convoluted. Like, for example, if only dragons could breed with other dragons, then we'd have, like, at least some kind of a reason why Zephyr's choices were limited if she wants a biological child. But it's still really fucking stupid. Why does she wait until the war is in full swing to ask Sombron? Sombron also had tons of children who made it to adulthood, and you're telling me that she couldn't have asked any of them to help her? Come on. This stupid character motivation also does everything it can to undermine the Hounds are family as a concept in general, because apparently the only children Zephyr wants must be biologically hers. Ugh. Also, her family, her quote family unquote, being the other hounds, a bunch of humans that she only recently met despite being thousands of years old, is also boring and not believable in the slightest. She treats Marnie manipulatively constantly, treats Mavir like he's a fucking dog, and is only civil or even remotely normal to Gris. Her seeing Gris as a son, or him seeing her as like a mom, older sister figure, could have been really good and meaningful, but we only see this in their monologuing death scene, and it's boring because of that. The Hounds are family in general is just the game telling us this information to, what, try to convince us, to make us feel bad for these characters? Like, they're not family, they don't feel like family. I would buy into this idea as like, oh, it's like a toxic, abusive family dynamic, you know, if the game actually fucking put effort into showing us that. I'm literally begging the writers, to look at The Bear, Season 2, episode Fishes, for an absolutely abusive, vile, but also like believable and emotional toxic family dynamic. That episode made me so anxious, and it reminded me my family dynamic was never like toxic like that, but it still reminded me of my family dynamic in the like talking over one another at the supper table, kind of petty bullshit that goes on within like families. I didn't get that feeling from the Hounds. In fact, I got nothing at all from the Hounds. Anyway, I think the biggest letdown with Zephyia, besides like her god-awful character design, is that she could have been a really good, or at least really interesting character, and the Hounds in general could have also been really good, but the game doesn't take the time to do anything meaningful with them, and so they both feel severely undercooked. Especially when you consider Zephyia's age and origins. Am I going to talk about all the Hounds? Yes, my reasoning for this is actually because the Hounds, as Sombron's like closest followers or whatever, are extremely important to the story in that sense, and I feel like you cannot ignore them, even if you desperately want to. So moving on to the next Hound, I fucking hate Marnie. I don't think I'm alone in this. I think a lot of people hate her. I feel like the game went out of its way to show me what a god-awful person she was, and then she had a slight change of heart because she learns of Vale's tragic uwu backstory. Oh my gosh. Suddenly I'm supposed to be like, wow, she's so selfless. She really cares. No. No thank you. You can take that manipulative storytelling and fucking shove it. The way that Mavir's motivations suddenly shift toward Marnie's sacrifice is also weird and feels bad and fake and unearned. I never found it believable that there was a connection between them in the first place, let alone one strong enough to impact him deeply for the rest of the story. I'd literally take anything that made them feel connected at this point because the game doesn't sell it at all. And if you can't tell by now, the game does this a lot. It's constantly telling you how to feel in a tell-don't-show way. I feel like I should say something about Madeline here. The Fell Xenologue really threw me for a loop when it suggested that Madeline was in love with her Mavir and that maybe he returned those feelings. I'm not opposed to this in general, as this other world is pretty different, and Madeline feels like, I don't know, she feels more like a real character than Marnie ever did, but there's something about the way it carries over to the main story and the Mavir Madeline supports, and therefore Marnie herself, that bothers me. It sort of feels like it's the kind of story or interaction that just doesn't translate very well to supports, but they couldn't ignore it, honestly, so they did give it a go. And they were pretty good. I like that they both admitted that they were thinking of their other counterpart, but like, Marnie sucked. And Mavir supports don't give any insight about how he viewed her. The game just tells us he cares without ever showing us one time why. How to fix this? Oh my god. Well, I'm so glad you asked. Engage steals shit from other games like non-stop, especially Fates, without ever doing anything at all interesting about it, or using them in meaningful ways. So fuck it, we ball. Let's steal some stuff from Path of Radiance to fix this. We should have seen somewhere in the main story that Mavir took in Marnie when she was young and raised and trained her before they both joined the Hounds. As an aside, this is how Mavir and Madeline in the Fell Xenologue meet, but we can't assume this is how they met in the main game since Marnie's backstory is honestly just like completely different to Madeline's. Anyway, if Mavir had raised and trained Marnie like a father, mentor, or like literally anything at all, I'd have easily bought him feeling shitty about her death. At that point, she's basically family to him. Then it could be implied that he joined the Hounds with Marnie but regrets doing so. This kind of situation could feel similar to who? General Shiharum from FE9, and that he more or less escaped one bad fate, only to walk right into another one. Shiharum didn't like that his daughter was more or less being corrupted by her environment, but his options were limited, so he stayed. They could have pulled this with Mavir. He didn't approve of how Marnie was turning out with the bad influences in the Hounds, for example, and maybe even didn't care for Elusia in general, but he quickly gets to a point where, just like Shiharum, it's too late now. He's in too deep to leave. Anyway, if they'd leaned into that kind of relationship from the start, where Mavir more or less raised Marnie and then stayed in the Hounds despite not agreeing with them, because he couldn't safely leave once he was in too deep, I feel like Marnie learning the truth and then acting to free Vale would have been a way more interesting end for her, and really lend support to Mavir's despair over her death. Maybe he shouldn't have told her the truth, right? Or maybe he should have praised her often enough that she never turned to Zephia to hear it. That's the kind of character stuff that has some chew to it, you know what I mean? That's delicious spaghetti regretti. This would have made the disconnect in the Mavi or Madeline supports like really juicy too, you know what I mean? Where where Madeline was like in love with her Mavir, and this world's Mavir viewed Marnie as like a daughter or younger sister or something. Unfortunately, the way the game approached both of these characters was just pretty bad, honestly. No nuance. We die like men. Also, I know Marnie's I hate yous to Mavir are some kind of like tsundere or childish bullshit, but the point of that trope is that their care comes through despite their words. We never see that with Marnie. She never shows that she actually cares about Mavir as a person. Nothing in the game refutes her I hate yous or makes us think otherwise. So it's poorly implemented at like a bare minimum. The TLDR with Marnie is that if you're gonna make her unlikable, even hateable, at least do it in a way that makes sense with your planned 11th hour change of heart. Bare minimum for her, she should have just liked the original Veil to begin with. That would have probably fixed the whole thing. I mean, I went out of my way to come up with like a much more detailed thing, but that's because I feel like if the Hounds had any kind of more family type connection within it, it would still feel more cohesive even if it was like a broken family. You know what I'm saying? Mavir just feels like a guy who is there but shouldn't be, and it wouldn't bother me except that at no point does he feel connected to any of the other Hounds. Miss me with that. And again, like I said with Marnie, I really think tying Mavir to her in some way would have gone a long way toward making his presence in the Hounds make a lot more sense, as well as his, like, despair in seeing Marnie die. We do know that Mavir follows Veil, but I feel like there's just a better way to do it, you know what I mean? Anyway, I do appreciate that once Mavir joins you, his character becomes heavily invested in atoning and like doing the right thing, because he's aware enough to know that even if he didn't do all of those terrible things himself, or even directly, he was complicit still in a great many atrocities and must take responsibility for that. I might be biased, though, because I married him. So now let's talk about Sombron. Sombron also sucked as villain. Why does he look like that when none of his children do? His motivation for evil is shockingly stupid, but not really in a general sense so much as in context. If he was just a really immature character, or even a child with more power than he should reasonably have, think of Zephia's backstory, it would feel fine as, like, fresh history. But he spent thousands of years to start the first war, which is fucking ridiculous. And then even after being asleep for another 1,000 years, picked right the fuck back up with his bullshit. Mock Nurgle all you like, but at least his quest for knowledge started out with a mostly normal reasoning behind it. Sure, he got lost in the dark magic sauce and more or less forgot his original reasons for all his work, but at least his motivation was like something believable to start. And that he got so lost in dark magic that he forgore his reasons for fucking studying in the first place felt okay. Like, not great, admittedly. I'm not that biased, but it did feel okay. It's like a serviceable excuse, you know what I mean? Sombron's backstory is thus. His world was in conflict, and then his people were all killed but him. He was exiled to Elios because reasons, but he managed to sneak an emblem from his world to Elios. Because the emblem was summoned by fell magic, it remained silent and strong, and inspired him to do things on his own. One day, a village of people were nice to him, and more or less adopted little Sombron, and the emblem disappeared. It stopped inhabiting its ring. This made little Sombron angry, and he razed the village to the ground, and then spent thousands of years trying to reunite with this emblem, starting wars to get all the rings so that he could go to other worlds to look for his emblem friend. His silent-ass emblem friend. What a fucking stupid story. Like, again, if the whole game was a parody, this might be more forgivable, but, like, no Fire Emblem villain in the history of ever has had this dumb of a reason for being evil. I will say that, like, the thing about Nurgle and why Nurgle works when this doesn't, even though Nurgle's, like, dabbling in evil for the sake of evil and stuff, is, like, silly, is that Nurgle's original reason was to open the gate so that he could see his wife and children again, and so then he had like a personal stake in that, right? And Sombron has a personal stake in this emblem as well, but the emblem doesn't talk. it's really hard for me to buy into him being that close that he would spend thousands of years after this goal, where Nurgle having the wife, having children, that's a connection that I could believe would carry someone to a goal for a really long time. Anyway, Fel Magic summons silent emblems for literally no fucking reason. They really want you to imagine that the emblems have free will when summoned via divine magic but not fel magic, even though the whole game basically shows us that none of the emblems have any free will or choice at all, regardless of who summons them. There's also something rage-inducing about red is bad and fel is bad. It's exhausting. Like, I get the meta reason for the red thing with the blue, the divine dragon, Alir, blah 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 blah. I don't shut the fuck up. But the game goes out of its way to be like, you're your own person. You can make your own choices. The sins of your father are not yours to bear or take responsibility for. You can choose to do better even if you were born and raised to be bad. And then it goes and makes Alir 100% divine dragon, casting off and out their fel dragon heritage in a very literal sense. Do you think the writers realize how this undermined their own themes and stomped them right into the fucking ground? And also, like, the meta reason why fel dragons, even when they're good people, can only summon silent emblems is, like, such a disturbing concept to me. I feel like there is something to be said here that's bad, but I can't think of it. Just know that it feels icky. Moving on. Well, sort of. Sombron's emblem, Emblem 0, is never stated to be any particular character, but I'm pretty sure we're meant to believe this emblem is somebody specific. We know the emblem must have had a physical body since it was able to travel to another world, and we know that the only reason Alir is capable of traveling to other worlds is because they are an emblem with a physical body by the end of the game. In the Zephyr and Sombron conversation from the past, Sombron remarks on a familiar presence, which is Alir, that he knows cannot be the Zero Emblem, because the Zero Emblem is gone. A lot of people think that this means that the Zero Emblem is Alir, but that doesn't make any sense, even with time travel. I think Sombron just recognizes emblem with a physical body as feeling a particular way, which makes sense because he can also sense other emblems, you know what I'm saying? On the Somniel, there is a shrine, in a dark place, for none other than Sami. Sami is kind of an enigma, and also silent, but like a comforting little guy. Sombron, Somniel, Sami. Is this something? Sami gives bond fragments, and you form a bond with Sami over the course of the game, like an emblem. He was with Lumera for a long time. It's not hard to imagine that Sami left Sombron's side when he felt that Sombron was going to be okay, and that he ended up with Lumera when she ended up alone and without her family. He's also so small that imagining Sombron smuggling him out of his own world when he was dumped off in Elios isn't that difficult. Also, the Somniel is not accessible to Sombron because only divine dragons can get there, or at least have access. So this explains why he couldn't find Sami for all of those years. This also explains why, at the end of the game, he thinks he feels his presence again. We took the Somniel to Sombron. And to be honest, this detective work would feel really cool if the story wasn't so fucking stupid. I think it really goes back to the fact that when I was playing the game, I was pretty much convinced that the war 1,000 years ago was actually what Engage should have started with. I stand by that. The history was poorly thought out to begin with, so we might as well have just started there. My brain is telling me that it should have been a short 10-chapter prologue where Alir meets and gets to grow close to Lumera. With something like this, we would have felt some kind of connection to the characters and story as it unfolded. This concept could have mimicked Lynn's mode from FE7 too, where on subsequent playthroughs you could just skip it if you wanted to. If it's a celebration of the series, this would be another fun nod. Seeing Alir slowly come into themselves as a character for those first 10 chapters would have been great. We have Lumera, who had already lost everyone dear to her, a lover per the Pact Ring chapter, and perhaps children too. She finds a child whose father doesn't love them when she herself has so much love to give and nowhere to direct it. Tying her mothering of Alir into grieving for the child or children that she already lost? God, it would have been a really great prologue, and I probably would have felt something when Alir awoke with no memories. I also feel like this would probably make Lumera a good foil for Zephyr in that she didn't need a bazillion years to figure out that adoption is also satisfying, but anyway, I would know what Alir was missing when they woke up without the memories. Like, I would know how much they were loved, even without the game having to tell me outright 1 bazillion times. And I don't hate what they did with Lumera, but I just feel like it all happened so fast, and I myself don't even care about Lumera, so it's really hard for me to, like, get into the beginning of this game because it's just done in kind of like a clumsy way, I guess. Anyway, I just feel like there's a lot of cool stuff you could do with a prologue like that if you were careful about how it was presented. And it opens up the possibility of having a small squad of interesting prologue characters too. So, like, sure, they would have all, or at least mostly, died in the 1,000-year gap between the prologue and main game, but I think it would be alright for the sake of telling a much better story. And also, you could probably meet some of Alir's other siblings this way, and I think that would actually be super cool. And then if you wanted to tie the Fell Xenologue into it, maybe you could have, like, killed some of the siblings in that prologue that then show up in the Fell Xenologue. You know, blah, blah, blah. I'm just, like, spitballing. Don't take me too seriously. Anyway, I feel like having prologue characters that end up dying between the gap or whatever would be like a worthwhile sacrifice for the sake of telling a better story. And again, I'm just being fucking delusional. Like, the story of this game feels half-baked at best, so it's not like it would be hard for literally anyone to come up with a better presentation. I just was like throwing out a couple of ideas. I don't want to go into too much detail about the plot in general because, like I said, it's not very well conceived or implemented on any front. Vale doesn't make a lot of sense, and not just the magic mind control bullshit either. The fact that she shows up in suspicious, random places, and Alir thinks this makes her a friend, let alone like a close, good, bestie kind of friend, is an insult to my intelligence. If Alir was 100% their own character, I still would not excuse this because nobody would react that way, but at least it would be a little bit more forgivable of a writing sin. As it is, they are an Avatar character, so I really do wish that they would show some fucking common sense. King Morian is an idiot, which makes me look more closely at his name. Like, okay, I guess it was there the whole fucking time. Anyway, Hyacinth has some motivation to want to eliminate Brodia as a threat, but this war being on for like hundreds of years is just fucking stupid. Speaking of that, the war going on while Salm buries their head in the sand and Firene sips tea and Lumera twiddles her thumbs and just lets it fucking happen is rage-inducing. I've seen some people speculate that this is why Elusia turned to worshipping Sombron in the first place, and we kind of learn in Mavir's supports that his mother started doing this, kind of like in grief, more or less after his father died. But like, Sombron tried to destroy everything and cause chaos. How did worship of him gain such a foothold in a country like Elusia? Who made this come about? Has the history been twisted there? Like, what's going on? In Tales of Symphonia, and this is a spoiler, so if you do intend to play that game and you don't want to be spoiled, 3, 2, 1... We learn that Martel is a false goddess, and that her younger brother basically invented a religion worshipping her after her tragic death. He dragged 3 close, basically immortal friends into this bullshit, and sold this story for hundreds of years. By the time the game starts, the whole world more or less believes in this religion, like, wholeheartedly, which is cool because it does feel grounded in something. The reveal that it was all a lie, and that having a chosen lineage was just an elaborate scheme to find a suitable vessel to transplant his sister's soul into, feels wild. And sure, it's elaborate and over the top, but it's still grounded in something reasonable and, more importantly, emotional. It's also clear that it took a very long time for the world to get this way. 4,000 years, in fact. Sombron is such a nothing sauce villain with purely selfish motivations that he doesn't even disguise. It's hard to imagine that anyone believes in him. He's not hot. He's not charismatic. What is the appeal? What is he promising anybody that they'd want to follow him? That they'd believe in him? Or in anything he had to say? And like, sure, maybe his followers believe he was misunderstood or something, but the game never tells us that. It never even goes into like what the teachings of Sombron's followers even are. Worse, Ivy and Mavir knew more or less the whole time that Sombron was bad news. Or at least that his followers were. Speaking of his followers, Hyacinth. We're told he was like a good dad, but the game gives us no proof of this. Fates was also bad about this, but for some reason Hyacinth is basically Garen 2.0, but the writers didn't learn anything. He had a horde of wives, and he let them treat one another like shit. He was a terrible husband, and I would argue letting his children grow up in this environment kind of tells me that he wasn't a very good father either. Are there other children? Like, this whole thing is stupid. It just feels like they stole it from Fates, which, if I'm remembering what I read correctly, I believe, like, the writing team overlapped with Fates, so, like, they just stole their own ideas, but, like, they stole them and, again, didn't do anything better with them. Like, they didn't learn their lessons from it fucking sucking the first time. This, honestly, okay, so, quick sidebar, but Engage feels a lot like it was basically Fates, but then they changed a few things, but, like, not in a better way, and then built on that, and it made it worse somehow. Anyway, to be clear, a lot of the problems like this would be forgivable if they were standalone complaints. The problem is that they're not. It's not just that Vale's role in the story makes little sense. It's not just that Sombron's motivation is stupid. It's not just that the Hounds are nonsense villains. It's not just that Hyacinth was dabbling in Sombron shit for no really good reason. It's not just that characters seem to stand around and conveniently let things happen through inaction. I said earlier that a lot of the issues with Engage were small, and the issue isn't that there are a few small issues, but rather a lot of small issues that feed off of one another and snowball into an overall terrible story. Like, one cringy convenience thing in the story would be fine, maybe even two, but it's like 100 of these things all making the others worse. It's more or less a domino effect as well. Because Sombron doesn't work very well as a villain and doesn't feel believable as a character in general, the Hounds, his closest followers, fall apart. Because the Hounds fell apart, Elusia's worship of Sombron falls apart. Because Elusia's worship of Sombron falls apart, the main conflict falls apart. You get the picture. And I think the saddest thing about it is that it could have been fixed. They could have simplified the story. They could have, had some kind of history worth diving into. They could have rewritten the story to at least be mediocre instead of bad. But the way they present the war 1,000 years ago and the way the current world is presented, it just feels like pig slop to me. Some people are gonna like it, but they have shit taste. Or they're just really, really hungry. I'm not, though, so let's move on. Characters and supports. Luckily for all of you, I don't really have a ton of stuff to say here. The deep sigh is really kind of just encompasses everything. I do want to say, to start this section off, that good characters can carry a mediocre or even slightly bad story. Unfortunately, Engage's story is shit, and the characters of Engage are such a mixed bag that they don't really fix anything. Like all recent Fire Emblem games, I feel like there are a good number of nothing sauce supports in Engage. I'm still of the firm opinion that supports should all feel good or at least interesting, and this means supports should be pretty limited for most of the cast. I feel like Engage did try harder to do this than Three Houses did, they did cut back, but they didn't cut back enough for me. Out of the main cast, it looks like maybe 8 is the lowest amount of supports anyone gets, and out of the DLC characters, Madeline gets the lowest with 5. To compare with FE7, the most supports anyone got is 7, and 14 cast members were able to do that. The remaining 28 got less supports, and several characters only were able to get 3. FE8 cut this even further. Only 2 characters get 7 options, that's Erica and Ephraim. Everyone else gets less, most capping out at 5. 2 characters get 3 supports each. If you're already thinking of some shit support chain in Fire Emblem 7 or one of the other earlier games to kind of tell me that they also had bad options, I'm gonna stop you right now. I know this. But the thing about pre-Awakening Fire Emblem games is that the amount of gimmick characters and the amount of cringy supports that give us nothing were really low per game. Yes, FE has always had a few shitters, but only a few, across many games. And I think it goes back to the fact that the reason that there are so many shit supports in more recent Fire Emblem entries, starting pretty much with Awakening, is just that there are so many supports in general that it gets hard to flesh them out, and especially when they added the child characters in and things like that, you just have so many supports that have to be written that there's no way that they're all going to be meaningful, and that is a problem. Engage has a few really good supports, but because there are so many in general, Ivy has 13. They tend to just repeat the same ideas, and not in a new or particularly interesting way. Using Ivy as an example again, her support chain with Diamant is really good. The ghost thing gets brought up, but the way it's dealt with is quick and it feels like just a small aside. The real meat of her supports ends up being her seeing Diamant as being similar to her, and that he feels a lot of the same concerns she does regarding the future. Then they work together to decide how they might rule their countries and ensure peace between them. The fear of ghosts thing in like most of her other supports, boring, especially because it comes up so many times without really telling us anything about it. We don't get a history of it, and it's not really fun or anything. It's not even funny. I'd excuse it in the Panette support because it's Panette's aesthetic, but it shouldn't have like appeared in any other support at all. Her admitting this fear doesn't even feel particularly meaningful when it feels like she tells tons of people about it. What's the big deal that Diamant figures it out? Everybody else fucking knows already. Alchrist also suffers from this, and arguably to like a worse degree. His "woe is me, I'm worthless" thing is just really annoying, honestly, but you watch him seem to make meaningful progress in a support chain, only to then watch him go right back to it in another. It feels kind of weird, and I don't even hate that he's down on himself. I just hate that this one personality trait feels overwhelmingly like it's his entire personality. And it feels like a little bit worse when he does have supports that show what a thoughtful, considerate person he is. Like his supports with Saphir were really nice when he gets to talk about his mom, and his supports with Saline where they talk about like their brothers and how worried they are about them and make a pact to like look out for one another's brother. Like that was sweet. But then I have to listen to him talk to several other people and tell them that he's a worthless speck of dirt again. And I'm like, that's it, dude, I can't stand you anymore. He's frustrating, but like the frustration isn't really Alchrist. It just specifically stems from him having too many supports where his poor self-confidence is the running joke of the support chain and the big focal point, rather than literally anything else. The last thing I have to say about supports is that I really wish that there had just been fewer stinkers in the bunch, because I feel like so many dumb supports fail to do much to prop up the world. And you know what I mean here. Engage needs all the help it can get when it comes to that. To be fair too though, I think if the main story had been better, I wouldn't really mind the bad supports as much, but when so many supports are stupid and the main story is stupid, it gets hard to believe in the world, let alone the characters and their motivations. And like, as a longtime Fire Emblem player, I want to take the characters and the story seriously. Like, I want to like them. I guess the dumb support chains make the good ones stick out more? But for every good chain I read, I felt like I was just seeing 3 that were really nonsense. As far as the characters in general go, I found myself somewhat intrigued by a few of them. Like Ivy, for example, but the way these characters in particular live and die on their supports and interactions with other characters, because the world building and main story are so bad, means they pretty much all fell kind of flat for me. Like, it's very unusual for me to finish a Fire Emblem game and not even consider writing a fanfic, but I'd have to make up so much stuff to write, like, an even remotely interesting story, and nobody in the cast feels worth the effort to me. Not even Diamant, and he's probably one of the more solidly written characters. And in fact, probably not really that hot of a take, but hot take, I felt very much like he should have just been the main character alongside Ivy because the Brodia-Elusia conflict was a more interesting nugget. It's very unfortunate. Now, to talk about emblems and paralogs kind of like as related to characters. So this is my next to last talking point, and don't worry, it won't be that long. I just feel like I can't talk about the game, the story, and the characters without also talking about the emblems and the paralogs. In my opinion, the emblems were poorly implemented. They didn't feel like people, maybe because they weren't, but the game shoving "we have free will when you summon us, ew woo" down our fucking throats was probably the biggest gaslighting that the game did. Shut the fuck up. They're like spirits, but not actual characters. But they have minds of their own and can talk. They can communicate amongst themselves. I hate this concept. It's creepy and weird. It feels gross and bad. I don't know how to explain this. They're like genies in bottles who should just be set free or something. Why is Sigurd's horse also an emblem? Question. Also, as an OG Lynn enjoyer, I did not feel happy or delighted to see her in this game. It just made me feel itchy and bad. She should be, like, long dead, so please, like, let her rest. I'm also kind of bored of paralogs in general, and I think they disrupt and fuck up the pace of games. I prefer the side story, guide-in, extra chapter concept instead because they're meant to be, like, slotted in to exist at specific points in the main story, and they're skippable, but, like, if you do them when they come up, I don't know, I just feel like them being made to be done when they come up and not getting to go back to do them later is like the point, and that's fun to me, and paralogs don't do it for me. Anyway, I didn't do many of the paralogs because they were boring, and I didn't care. They were really, really samey in how they were set up and presented story-wise, which made me just not care for them in any capacity. Again, as an OG Lynn enjoyer, I should have been pumped and excited to see Lynn's chapter, but it sucked. Everyone else gets a familiar map or setting from their own game, and Lynn gets FE6. Why? That's a rhetorical question. I know why. Lynn is from Heroes, not FE7. It makes me mad, honestly. I hate how Heroes has, like, waifu'd the absolute shit out of Lynn and pushed her into bow-wielding territory for the sake of making her different. In the main story itself, too, this map just feels so out of place. It honestly just makes Engage's Dogwater world building feel even worse. I like the idea of Sakai in the sense of her, like, returning there at the end of FE7 is important to her character, unless you're a Hector Lynn or Elliewood Lynn shipper, rip to you, I guess. But I think the fun in these paralogs is meant to be in playing a recognizable map that meant something to the character. And this Lynn's map gives us nothing. Thanks for that. Her map should have been Chapter 10, the Lundgren map, where she can talk to Alir about having to fight to see her grandfather, and how much this meant to her because she thought she was all alone in the world. That this was an inheritance dispute that she wanted no part of could come up too, because she had to kill a relation just to get to know her grandfather. This is huge regarding the themes of loneliness and shitty family members that Engage talks about constantly. Instead, they pretty much just gave us nothing, so thanks for that. On to the Fell Xenologue. Luckily for all of us, I have run out of steam, so I don't have a whole lot to say about the Fell Xenologue. I played it, and at first it seemed like maybe kind of promising, but then it kneecapped itself into being kind of uninteresting, just like Engage's main story did. Mavir having the same name was a dead giveaway that he was going to die. I know that some people thought that he might betray you at first, and I thought that would have been an interesting twist, but they did the death thing, which was the bigger obvious flag, because of course you're going to get some of these DLC characters and you can't have two Mavirs, right? They should have just given him a different name to fit the theme, or let everyone's names be the same as original, since they were just fucking recolors anyway. Recolors were boring, by the way. I really wish the character designs, armor, clothing, whatever was different to differentiate them more. Maybe even their classes could be different. For example, Madeline as a cavalry class to show her training under Mavir could have been interesting. I like the Four Winds way more than the Four Hounds, but the story of the Xenologue in general was just kind of stupid, honestly. Like, it had some good ideas, but it did not present them very well. I don't know how anyone was surprised by Nell loving the original Divine Dragon of her world. That was obvious to me from, like, the second she opened her mouth. But also, are we not going to talk about her Divine Dragon's heritage? Where did he come from? Was he Lumera's actual child in that timeline, or was she in love with her brother? Like, half-brother. Are we going to talk about that? No? No? Can I marry Nell in the game? Can I, like, a S rank? Whatever. I don't even give a shit. Anyway, I love that at no point does Alir say anything about the Four Winds having counterparts on the other side that are, like, bad, which is frustrating. But she also never says she's Sombron's child either, which you would think would be relevant information to Nell and Nil. But nope, gonna keep all that to ourselves, I guess. I'm sure this is because you can play the Xenologue pretty early on in the game and they didn't want things to conflict too much, but still, it's stupid. Just let it be a post-game fucking thing, whatever. The fact that the royals all looked exactly the same, just had different personalities, and some animations were different. Good idea, good concept, but they were not interesting. And it felt kind of lazy to me. But DLC these days is a cheap cash grab, so I don't know why I hoped for anything better. The reveal that everyone was corrupted except the main group was convenient. More like cringe. That Rafal could raise perfect corrupted like this, that weren't even aware they were corrupted, is absolutely fucking insane. And never really looked deeply at, beyond, like, the most cursory, oh I regret my actions, support later. That is so boring. I think people liked the DLC mostly because it did try to be darker, but like, it was just as poorly written as the main game, just a lot shorter and therefore less painful. Also, I shouldn't have to say this, but like, grittier does not mean better. I don't know what I would have done for the DLC instead. Like, I haven't had that much time to think it over, and frankly, I have better ways to spend my time. But I do think it was a pretty lazy and cheaply done, not to mention presented, cash grab. And it worked, because I played it. I love it when I fall for this shit. Now, for my final thoughts. I will, truthfully this time, keep this brief. Engage is the definition of so close yet so far. They almost had something good there, and if gameplay is your biggest joy in Fire Emblem, and the characters and story are a distant second to you, I think you'll really enjoy the game for what it is. But if you're like me, and you play the game to get immersed in the story, the characters, and even the world building, this ain't it, Chief. This ain't it. Thanks for watching! I don't know if or when I might do another video, but you never know. Until next time.